Hey, how are you?
Hey, I am doing okay, but this middle-aged man has been to the gym 2 days in a row, thanks to my son.
Ooh.
And yesterday was arm day, and today was leg day. And so I just wobbled over to my chair, and now I am recording with you.
That's awesome. I just came back from the gym as well with my son, but we go to the climbing gym. So my arms are tired, but my legs are okay today. Kind of depends on which kind of climbing we do.
Okay, so for the uninitiated, what do you mean, what kind of climbing?
Um, I'm trying to figure out how to explain that. Generally speaking, you're either climbing something that's inclined so that you're kind of moving diagonally backwards and up, or you're moving diagonally up and forwards. So there's sort of a, does that make any kind of sense?
Yeah,
So you're kind of almost falling back or falling forwards. And if you're falling forwards, you're using your legs more. And if you're falling back, you're generally using your arms more. Uh,
fascinating.
I think either that or I'm doing it wrong, which is entirely possible.
If we have any avid climbers in the audience, maybe we can get a corrective email here.
Yes. Anyway, but I'm sure you didn't call to get a primer on climbing sans diagrams, because that just sounds like a horrible plan. So, right.
That was not on my to-do list today.
No, I'm sure.
Primer on climbing sans diagram. I did not write that down.
So what did you call about?
Yeah, so this is, in some ways, a little bit different of an episode for us. I've really been struck by our tendencies as Christians to respond to either the world or to respond to one another rather ferociously, right? And I'm struck by this in a couple of ways, right? We're reading a book for our Revelation study on the rise and fall of dispensationalism. And we're looking at the period of time where fundamentalism really came into its own. And fundamentalism was really an opportunity to react against or to unite against the teaching of evolution in schools and some of the modern biblical critical scholarship that was being done in scholarship circles. And
the sort of growth of the mass, the Walmarts of the world, right? Like that was the thing that kind of struck me was we're going to take a stand against big things.
Yeah.
Things like everything from the World Council of Churches to kind of whatever the predecessor of Walmart was. If it's big, it's bad.
Right. But oddly enough, the only way to fight the big bad thing was to organize and systematize and make a very clear line of us versus them. And so you have the birth of fundamentalism. And but then even within fundamentalism, right, then some people who have similar beliefs but divergent kind of belong in the fundamentalist camp, but then they start infighting. And now you have the people who adhere to dispensationalism and those that don't. And now you have this us versus them, even within fundamentalists. And again, these battle lines are drawn and we start breaking fellowship and we start fighting and not just fighting, but fighting like hell. And I really mean that. I know it's kind of a jarring term, but like fighting passionately. That's the way we use that term, fighting like hell. Like we got to fight like hell against modernism and the encroachment of all of this evil in the world. And we got to fight against bad doctrine. And we got to fight against all of these people that have these alternative beliefs. And it's not okay. We got to fight like hell to protect our claim or our stake in the world. And I've been really struck by the question, what if all of that fighting really is fighting like hell?
I think it is a fascinating phrase, and a fascinating phrase because it turns on this idea, right? When we say fight like hell, what we really mean is fight a lot. But what we're actually saying may be more accurate than
Right.
we mean it to be.
Yeah.
There may be something evil about a particular approach, either to the world or to our mission as Christians or to the way people of faith engage with the world. But yeah, this is deeply, deeply concerning to me, particularly in a moment like this when the world around us is very interested in getting in fights about things.
Or just fighting for your side, whatever your side is, right? I am
Mm-hmm.
struck by the fact that the very first thing that Donald Trump did after his assassination attempt was to stand up and chant the words, fight, fight, fight. But then on the other hand, the chant at the Democratic National Convention was, when we fight, we win. And so we have both sides saying fight, 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 and not just fight like hell, fight with all your might, fight. And Christians find themselves somewhere on the political spectrum and sometimes choosing to fight like hell on political issues. And feeling as though, and I get it, right? I think there's this feeling that the world is so off base with its morality. We've got to fight for some semblance of, quote, normal or good, or we've got to fight for the truth because we have the truth and the world doesn't. So we must stand up. And I think we take that mentality and we just really run with it without thinking.
Yeah. I mean, when I think back on the way in which my faith developed, or the context in which my faith developed, it was a context in which there was an intentional effort to distinguish us versus them on every side, right? The context I grew up in, we were definitely not charismatics or Pentecostals, and they
Yeah.
were definitely not Christians.
Right. And
And
I was a Baptist, so we were also not Pentecostal, but we were also definitely not Catholic.
yes, that was another one. On the other side, we were definitely not Catholics, and they are definitely not Christians,
Right.
right? And then there were, you know, then there were the people who went to like mainline churches like Anglicans and Lutherans and Methodists and they lost their faith many many moons ago, and we should probably get them saved.
No, and we have a
Um,
special word for those people. They're not just not Christians, they're apostate.
hmm. And I guess the two questions that come to my mind as I think about this are, how did we get there, and what's the alternative?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I could speak to the history of how we got here very well. But I can assume, based on our own time and space, and what I'm learning about the rise of fundamentalism, is that we got here by believing that we had to do something and deciding we would use the world's methods for doing something. And we forgot that we are apprentices to Jesus, and he has a different way of going about his kingdom work.
Absolutely. And I think there's a long church history of this, right? From Constantine on, we, the Christians, have perceived ourselves on some level to be fighting for the status quo,
Hmm.
right? In the Constantine's era, it was establishing the Holy Roman Empire. In the Middle Ages, it was retaking Jerusalem from the infidels. And in 20th century America, it was taking the fight to the modernists.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's the same attitude. It's, I'm going to pick a fight with you, and there's a cross painted on my shield to baptize my secular warfare. So let's
And
go.
yeah, well, and I want to soften that just a little bit. I do think there are people that genuinely think I'm going to pick a fight with you. But I also think there is a substantial number of people who believe that the fight was brought to them and that they have to respond and that they have to do something to defend truth or to stand for our Christian principles or to fight in God's army or whatever it is that motivates them. Like I saw this on a t-shirt and I assume it belongs to some Christian subculture context that I'm not familiar with. But the t-shirt said, "Lions, not lambs." And that, I think that mentality that's like, we're not just going to lay down and take it. We're going to be lions like the Lion of Judah, and we are going to join you in battle, is the mentality that I'm talking about. And so sometimes that means you're going to pick a fight, but sometimes it means you just believe you're responding to the fight that already exists.
Well, and if you let's take two other factors. One factor is if you read the Old Testament stories of Joshua and David and read yourself in a simplistic way into those stories. So you are Joshua, you are David, which is a way we teach people to read the Bible every single day.
Mm-hmm.
Suddenly, you are empowered by God and called by God to be the warrior.
Yeah.
And now let's take that theological piece and put it next to the fact that, to your earlier point about the fight coming to them, the world is a constantly changing place. In my lifetime, the internet has happened. Suddenly, I lived in a city that was over 50% non-white minorities. I had to deal with news coming from all over the world in a much faster way.
Cell
The
phones.
world, cell phones, thank you. The world is a drastically different place. And if the status quo seemed good before, any kind of change to that status quo could easily feel like an attack.
Yeah. Which is funny because I have been around people who express the opinion that I really don't understand, like the Mennonites or the Amish, and why they suddenly decided that they were going to freeze some era in history and say that was the as far as they were willing to go technologically. And, you can use these tools, but not these tools. You can use this product, but not that product. And that was as far as they were going to go. And I think that's what conservatism, that mindset, ultimately does. It just, maybe instead of saying, oh, I'm going to freeze frame at 1850, it's I'm going to freeze frame from
1950.
I don't know. Yeah, exactly. From 1950. And so I'm not saying that every advance in society is okay and we shouldn't question society. That's not what I'm saying. But it is fascinating that mentality of, oh, I feel attacked when things change, can be shown to be false by looking at, what we think is an odd way to live with, like, say, the Amish.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and this reminds me of an article that I have been wrestling with whether or not to mention because I have not fully read it and I heard it referenced. And I don't love referencing things that I have only heard about secondhand. But I'll reference it and I have it pulled up and I've skimmed it. That's not normally the best way to handle an intelligent article. But this article is from the Scientific American, which is a fairly respectable organization. They kind of know what they're doing.
Yeah.
And it analyzes what is the difference between liberals and conservatives. And I find this telling. In essence, what they found is that conservatives perceive there to be strict divisions in life. You're either this or this. You are for this or against this. This is true, this is not true. Liberals, on the other hand, tend to have a much grayer way of looking at the world. They would use words like truer that a conservative would never use. This is truer than that. Yeah, this seems like a great way to do things, but I see strengths of this other way as well. And with that kind of distinction, for whatever it's worth, it becomes understandable to me why Christians land in the conservative camp.
Yeah.
Because we do inherently believe in an actual truth that has an actual thing to say about actual reality, that does make formal statements about things like good and bad and right and wrong. And so, if that's what it means to be a conservative, it's understandable that we would land there, right?
Right. And why we would feel leery of Christian denominations who have chosen a more liberal path that borders on syncretism at times, where it is Christian and fill in the blank. And it blends too much of, or in some people's estimation, it blends too much of Christian thought with the world's thinking, and doesn't do enough black and white, this or that, objective, I don't know.
Categorization, let's call it that.
There you go, categorization.
Yeah, I totally agree. And as the world has shifted to something that's more pluralist, as multiple perspectives have become part of the conversation in what it means to be an American or what it means to be a Christian, the categorization instinct becomes complicated, I think. But I also think the categorization instinct, I need to put this in a box. I need to know whether this is right or wrong or good or bad or whatever. I think that instinct is far deeper down to the core of who we are as people than maybe we want to acknowledge. This is deeper than like a lot of my religious beliefs. This is like a core identity thing. And so when you touch that and say, you know what, maybe there's lots of right answers, suddenly you aren't just messing with my beliefs, you are messing with my view of the universe.
Yeah. Yeah. Which, we're not saying that there's more than one way to salvation and that there's more, there's not lots of right answers about, who God is and all of these things. But when Jesus said, love your enemies, how you go about that has lots of right answers.
Mm-hmm.
It has lots of wrong answers, but it has lots of right answers. And so we have to know what it is we're dealing with in that moment. Is this a practical expression of an objective truth, or are we making an objective truth claim?
That's a great distinction. And I think even within the objective truth realm, I think it's important for us to recognize the distinction between the objective truth and our truth claim.
Yes, right? Or our perception of the truth.
Correct. Because everything I say is not a truth. It is a perspective on the truth.
Yes.
And therefore, I should approach conversations with a far greater humility, because I know, as a good evangelical Christian, that total depravity of man tells me that even my best thoughts are on some level corrupted. So I shouldn't fight for them like they're not.
So all of this leads me to the question, so what? We call ourselves Christians. And the way we've defined that on the podcast is, I think, a helpful one. We are apprentices to Jesus. And as apprentices to Jesus, how we respond to the world, I think, has to be shaped by the way Jesus himself responded to the world.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering if you can point to various aspects of Jesus's life that help inform you on how we respond to the world. Yeah, I have some thoughts that have been creeping up in my mind, but I really want to see what your reaction is.
I am intrigued by the fact that Jesus was unalterably kind to virtually every human being he ever met. Right? Like he was kind. He was kind to the Gentile centurion. He was kind to the widow with the issue of blood who was ceremonially unclean. He was kind to people without asking for anything in return. He didn't be kind to them in order to get them saved, and then it was kind of this transactional hope that they would eventually do things his way. He was just being kind because that was his nature. And it wasn't trying to force them into something. If they were attracted to his way of doing things and they wanted to follow him, most of the time that was fine. Sometimes it wasn't. It certainly was not about promoting his message because he told some of them not to.
Yeah.
It was because he was kind.
He was, to a point. And this is where I really have a hard time fitting Jesus into a box. Because I believe you when you say he was kind, and there's lots of examples of that. But there's lots of counterexamples, like calling the Pharisees a brood of vipers, or turning over the tables. And maybe those moments stand out in our minds because they fit a little bit more with our humanity. Or maybe they stand out because they're just different from the way we normally see Jesus. And so how do you fit those things together?
No, I think this is a great question, and I'm curious your take on it as well. Particularly, let's zero in for a moment on cleansing the temple. This is a rebuke to the religious system. Is that fair?
I would say it's a rebuke of the exploitation of the religious system.
Fair enough. Yes, I meant that and did not say it quite that way. Absolutely. It is a rebuke of the exploitation of people's religious efforts.
Yes. As we're having this part of the conversation, it actually strikes me as this is a defense of the defenseless kind of a moment. These were the people that had to come to the temple and they had to buy their things for the sacrifices. And this is just the system that was set up, and it was fleecing the people. And we think about it from the money changers' perspective and from the people who are officiating the temple's perspective, and how awful and just, wow, you could have handled that a different way. Couldn't we have sit down and talked or what? No, this is just gross injustice. And I am defending the defenseless in my actions. When I see it from their perspective, suddenly I don't have any issue with this story.
Yeah. And there are very limited numbers of modern analogs to this, but they are not the famous preachers with microphones or the politicians with the giant war chests. Those are not analogous to what Jesus was doing.
Right. Well, neither, to take an extreme example, neither is blowing up an abortion facility.
100% not. No, absolutely not. I am struck by the way in which Jesus took a stand for the defenseless. And I see how this could easily translate over to the abortion conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but Jesus did not take a stand against the civic authorities who were doing things like this is the moment when Herod does, in the same years that Jesus is alive, Herod does all sorts of vile things, literally to members of his own family, and to all sorts of religious dissidents, and to many, many other people. And at no point is Jesus getting angry at that. What he's angry at is someone claiming to be a representative of God and abusing someone's religious desire to connect with God.
Yeah, I was talking with Shelley about all of these ideas because, like I've said, this has been on my mind, this idea of fighting like hell. And as we were talking about Jesus in particular, we said when Jesus got angry, it was always at the religious leaders. And when Jesus spoke up about all of these problems and all of these things that needed to get addressed, if he addressed them at all, it was always in the context of the religious leaders and how to follow God better. He stayed silent on Rome. Now, there are a lot of things that he did that clearly implied a challenge to Rome's authority. So I'm not saying that Jesus was not in any way a political figure, but I'm saying in terms of his teaching, he went into the temples and he taught about the kingdom of God. And when he expressed his ferocity, it was at the religious leaders who were leading people away from God. And that is a very different thing than my pet theology, what my view of the millennium is, or whether or not I agree with society's slant on pick your issue.
Absolutely. I was struck by how consistent your description of how Jesus acted is with Paul's directions in 1 Corinthians 5, where he says, for what have I to do with judging outsiders? Is it not those inside the church whom you are to judge? God judges those outside. Right? Like, why would I even consider judging people outside of the church? That doesn't make... And judging here, even the insider, is very clearly in this context not someone who has a slightly divergent theological opinion. If that was what Paul wanted, the Corinthian church would have been smashed to smithereens. Right?
Right. Yeah.
This is a church that is fractured dramatically because of its theological distinctions. And Paul is trying to put them back together.
Right.
But in putting them back together, he wants to make sure that our standards on character don't slip. For goodness gracious, please don't sleep with your mother. Is basically like the standard he's drawing here.
Well,
or your mother-in-law, I think. Right?
Right. Yes, he is addressing some moral issues, but at the same time, he's also trying to help them realize, let's keep first things first. Because I also had a verse pulled up here in 1 Corinthians. This is 1 Corinthians 2:2. For I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. That's it. That's the message. We have to just keep things, you got to keep first things first. And
Absolutely.
What I'm struck by, this is not the only time that Paul makes much of Jesus' crucifixion. And right now, as a church, we've been going through the Gospel of John, and we are now on to his trial and his conversation with Pilate, and he's about to be let off to be crucified. And as we've been studying this, I've been thinking a lot about Jesus as our crucified Messiah, and thinking if we're going to keep things first things first, and we're going to apprentice ourselves to Jesus, the thing that is central in all of the Gospels is his crucifixion and resurrection. And the thing that is central in Paul's theology and what he teaches every single church is Jesus Christ and him crucified. And there's something about being an apprentice to a crucified Messiah that seems antithetical to fighting like hell.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, Paul pulls this thought out. I've been reading through 1 Corinthians, so that's why it's on my mind. But Paul pulls this thought that you read at the beginning. I chose to know only Christ crucified while I was among you. He tells the believers to emulate him in this several times throughout the letter, going so far in chapter 8 to say, if anyone imagines that he knows something, he does not yet know as he ought to know. Oh, so you think you think you know? Then you're wrong. You don't know.
Yeah. I mean, that should stop a lot of theological arguments pretty immediately.
Right. Like, what I love about that verse is if you think about a theological argument, what's it going to do with it? It's going to turn the arguers into conversation partners who are pursuing the truth together.
Yes.
Because then suddenly it's, well, you don't have any idea what's going on, and I don't have any idea what's going on, and let's just see if we can get somewhere together.
Yeah. I mean, I can only imagine that. To me, it's easier to see that when we take the theological debates of a bygone era. And that is what we are studying as we look at the rise and fall of dispensationalism. And we see how church after church, body after body, group after group were dividing along their definitions of the millennial reign. You were a premillennial, or you were an amillennial, or you were a postmillennial, and we were not in fellowship if you did not agree with me. And then
absolutely,
our book happens to center on the premillennialists and their own internal divisions about mid-trib, post-trib, pre-trib, and all of the other ways that you can subdivide eschatology or the study of the end times. And again, people were splitting over these issues. And it doesn't seem like any of them took the advice that you just said, which was maybe we sit down as humble conversation partners pursuing the truth together.
And what would that look like? And not only for me, what would that look like to us as believers, but in a world that is profoundly fractured. It is so American to fight like hell.
Yeah.
And everybody's walking around angry or wounded because it's so natural to us. What would it look like to a world that is watching us if the church was amazingly good at this?
Yeah.
I texted you this from a teaching that the superintendent of the Assemblies of God gave and just recently released an article about. The essence of the article is, how should we as Christians act in this moment of profound political turmoil? And he had a lot of great things to say, but I love this quote. He said, "Imagine the power of our witness if every Christian related to non-believers with grace, gentleness, and respect." Wouldn't it be incredible if we were known as the grace, gentleness, and respect people? I think people would flock to Jesus. People would break down the doors of the church.
Yeah.
Except they would do it nicely.
I don't know. I mean, when you read the Gospels and you see Jesus and all of the crowds that were pressing in on him, I mean, there were times where literally the Gospels say they were so packed in there they couldn't even eat. Or, you know, you think about the leper the paralytic and his friends, and they cut a hole in the freaking roof. So maybe they would just break down the doors.
They just might, because, you know, Romans chapter 2 says it's the kindness of God that leads to repentance.
Yes.
And I don't think it's any secret that the church as a whole is in decline in our culture. And this might be why. This might be a piece of why.
Yeah. I think as I continue to apprentice myself to Jesus, I see two things at once: an absolute conviction of his kingship and the kingdom of God, and the need to treat everybody with gentleness as image bearers of God.
That is it. Exactly. Let's do that.
Mm.
All the way through the theological arguments, all the way through election day. Let's do that.
Agreed. Well, let me turn to the audience and say, what is your reaction to this episode? And do you have a desire to apprentice Jesus in a similar way? We would love to hear your thoughts. We would also love to have you share this episode with a friend and start your own conversation about how we engage with the world and how we engage with one another within the church when we disagree. I think it would be a great conversation to have at any time.
I would love that. And the more we have this conversation, I think we are doing something worth doing.
Yes, exactly. Well, that is a little bit of what I've been thinking about. But Josh from Missouri, you got so many irons in the fire. I am very curious what you have been thinking about.
Oh, I'll tell you what. I've been thinking a lot about 1 Corinthians, as you can tell from my various quotes. But I got to be honest. Today at the rock climbing gym, I found myself thinking about you.
Oh no, this can't be good if you were thinking about me at the gym.
I thought of you because someone had this T-shirt on that said, "Keep Portland weird."
Yes.
And I was just thinking of you.
Yes. So that is a common refrain in the Portland area. There are bumper stickers that say "Keep Portland weird." There are T-shirts. It's a slogan that you can find everywhere. And then people riff on it, and like breweries will say "Keep Portland beard." And so it's a thing. But when one of your claims to fame is a guy dressed up as Darth Vader riding a unicycle and playing a bagpipe all through town, that he's called the Unipiper. You can look him up. And that's a thing, and that's a Portland thing. And so, yes, keep Portland weird.
I love it. So I know it's not deep. I know it's not profound. Like you said, I have a lot of things going on in my head right now. Workshop coming up, teaching a class, all sorts of stuff. But right now, that is what I was thinking about, was the fact that you live in the weird capital of the universe.
All right. Well, continuing with the Northwest theme,
Ruh-roh.
I also do not have a very profound thought, but if you will spare me for just a moment, I would like to rant for a bit. It is now September, and I had such high hopes for my Mariners this year, and they have had the most abysmal season I could think of. Now, technically, they have a winning record, but it has just been awful. Their offense has underperformed the entire season. It has made me so angry. I tell you, I have been a Mariners fan my whole life. I have watched some really bad teams. I have stuck with them through thick and thin. I have never had the excitement that I had going into this season.
You really were very pumped.
I was on record. I think there's a podcast episode out there where I make a prediction about like a supreme number of wins. I don't even remember what it was. And
more than they actually got.
More than they actually got. Now, the season's not over as we record today. There's still like something like 18 games left. There's like, I think Fangraphs has a 9% chance that they actually make the playoffs. But I have never been more angry with a team than this Mariners team. And I'm livid. It's just been a lost season. And I am going to be surprised if they have any fans left after all of this. Everyone is angry. They should have done better than they did, and they have just played terrible baseball all year long. Unless you're a starting pitcher, in which case you're amazing. And we just wasted your whole year, and I'm sorry.
Well, to all of those Mariners fans who are listening, we expect a written apology.
Yes. Yes. From the GM. All right. This is not a Mariners podcast. I'm going to let it go for now.
All right.
But,
well, are you ready? Normally it's a giant fall when we actually go into our Which Josh, but I don't feel like it's that. We don't have that far to fall today.
No, we certainly don't. We have made that bad of an episode. So you're welcome, everyone.
All right. Well, are you ready?
All right. Lay it on me.
All right. Which Josh was so scared of his wife that she had to leave the room?
Oh my gosh. Okay. So this is me, and I cannot believe I've never shared this on the podcast. This was maybe 6 months into married life, and we had let the dishes pile up, and we didn't have a dishwasher. So we were in college still. Shelley was sitting on the couch. She was doing some homework. The apartment was very, very quiet. She had been reading for quite a while, and I had been doing dishes for quite a while. Like I said, we had let them pile up. And so I was just hand scrubbing, and I was in the zone. And unbeknownst to me, she set her book down, came into the kitchen, and came up behind me and gave me a hug from behind. Scared me to death. I had no idea she was there. And she laughed. She thought it was funny that I was scared and I jumped so high or whatever. And then she came back to complete the hug. And I'm like, no, we're not doing this. You're not going to hug me now. I am too jacked up. You just need to go back to your couch. You need to do your thing and leave me alone. She scared me out of my wits.
Oh, man. Well, I'm glad you guys are still married.
Yeah, the hug that ended our marriage, right? No, it was fine. It's a great story to joke about all these years later.
Oh, man. Well, are we on for next week?
I'm looking forward to it. Let's do it.
All right. I'll talk to you then.
All right. Bye.